We're going to be talking about what you need to do to prepare a plan for your shelter during an emergency, or before, during, and after an emergency. So, disasters, this is the official FEMA definition of disaster, but really what a disaster is when an area is overwhelmed and first responders or emergency personnel or animal shelters, animal rescue, there's just too much to do for a single organization, so it requires multiple organizations to come in and participate. There's all kinds of disasters. So usually when we start talking disasters, we talk about natural disasters and man-made disasters. So natural disasters include floods, hurricanes, which might be experiencing down south, tornadoes, wildfires, that sort of thing. And a lot of people don't think about the man-made disasters. It might be a hazardous material spill. We have terrorism that could possibly take place. And then power outages, which is something else that is a concern with like cybersecurity and everything, that somebody might do something. I guess it's terrorism, but somebody might do something with our electrical grid. So today it's working fine, and then tomorrow it might not be working at all. Or like in places in California where a power company might actually turn off the power so that they don't cause any wildfires or something like that. So there's man-made and natural disasters. But also, it's important to think about different kinds of disasters and how they're going to impact your shelter. So there's direct disasters. That might be a fire in your shelter, or maybe your shelter floods or something like that. But then there's also, your shelter might be indirectly impacted by, maybe there's a bridge collapse or a road closure due to flooding, like in this photo, something like that. So it may not impact your shelter, but it's still, or directly, but it might impact people getting there, egress, ingress, that sort of thing. So there's those two things to think about when you're looking at possible planning for your disaster. So we also have a couple different kinds of disasters. We have what's more of a spontaneous disaster. And again, it might be something like a fire, an electrical fire within your shelter, an earthquake. So where I live, we just had an earthquake that happened yesterday. No planning, no warning of this thing. It just happened. So that's more of a spontaneous disaster. And these are disasters that you really can't do anything about. You can plan ahead, which is what we're talking about now, but you can't plan a few days ahead. It might be specific to a certain area. Maybe it is a fire in your shelter, or maybe it's a power pole went out and it impacts your electricity. Or it might be widespread, such as an earthquake, where it could take the entire area out. So spontaneous disasters can have both very localized or widespread impacts. Then we have the incoming disasters. So the hurricane, tropical storm that's happening right now, we've been hearing about this for a few days. So one of the things that I hear quite a bit is, what do you do during a hurricane or a wildfire if you have to immediate evacuate? Well, generally with these types of disasters, there is some planning. You can have some planning. You can have some warning with these sort of things. So when you're creating your plan, it might be good to have a plan. All right, here comes this. If you're in hurricane country, it might be a good idea to have a plan a day out, 2 days out, that sort of thing. So 2 days out, you might start getting everybody localized. 1 day out, you might start moving your animals and start talking about essential personnel and that sort of thing. So this is fairly common if people pay attention to it. So it's important that you really start looking at your weather, or paying attention, working with emergency management if it's a wildfire. Whatever the disaster is in your area, it might be really important to start looking at that and start planning ahead. And when you're creating your plan, start looking at what are the things that we can do a couple days ahead of time, so that way when it hits, we're ready to go. And this is one of the things a lot of shelters, or a lot of people I should say, don't do. They wait until the very last second, and then they're scrambling trying to get everything out. When you're looking at disasters, and I just realized I don't have a clock here, so I'm going to turn that on right there. When you're looking at disasters, it's important to know your location. And this is important because a lot of shelters, unfortunately, are in areas where you can get inexpensive land. Sometimes it's where it's really accessible, but it's inexpensive land. And why is that inexpensive land? It might be because it's in a flood zone, or it might be because there's just not much around there. So it's important to know where you are. Are you near a chemical storage? So are you in a warehouse district, which seems to be where a decent amount of shelters are. And if you're in a warehouse district, there might be all kinds of nasty stuff around there, storage places for chemicals or heavy machinery or that sort of thing. So if that happens, if there's a gas leak at the chemical storage, that could impact your shelter. Is there a major transportation route? And this is something a lot of people don't think about when it comes to disaster either, is how much can, first of all, is there a highway? If it's a major transportation route, is there something where a truck could get in a wreck and possibly have a chemical spill? Is there train tracks right near where the same thing could happen? Or on the opposite side, are you down a really dinky little road to get to your shelter to where it's going to be really hard for people to get in and out because it might flood or something? It's just not a major concern for Department of Transportation. If it snows, they may not plow that certain area. So it's important to know that sort of thing. Municipal water is another one. Are you on a well? I came from the fire service, and we had 8 fire stations, and only one of them was on city water. Everything else was on well water. And so that was a really big concern for us, because every time we had to wash our gear, we had to take it to this one place that was on city water. The other part to that is, if you're on city water, you might still have water when the power goes out. If you're on a well, you may not have water because you don't have power, unless you have a generator, of course. So, and then ingress and egress for emergency vehicles is another thing that you need to look at. So one of the things that you might want to do, I love this photo, but one of the things that you might need to do is form a planning committee. And this can vary completely, and it will vary completely depending on what your shelter is, what your goal is, who's around. But it might be a standalone shelter, or you might be a city or county shelter. And so if you're a city county shelter, then this planning committee might need to include more government officials, because they're going to be the one that dictates some of what's going to happen. You need to look at available resources, how many animals you currently have. Most shelters, is there anybody in this room that works in a shelter that's not almost at full capacity? Yeah, so that's before the shelter happens, or before the disaster happens. So what happens when there's a disaster? You're already almost at full capacity, so when there's a disaster, there's probably going to be incoming animals. So that's something to look at, is what can you handle? And then the possible hazards, which we already talked about, and the types of animals. This is an important one because it's hard for me not to walk around. It's an important one because, do you normally take dogs and cats? But will there be horses and cattle and guinea pigs and snakes and whatever coming into your shelter? And what are you able to handle? So that's going to be important to look at when you're preparing this plan. And then, of course, your location, which we've already talked about. So when you have a planning committee, sorry for all the text on this one, when you have a planning committee, it's important to look at the disaster before, during, and after the disaster. So some of the things to look at is who's going to be essential personnel. When this disaster happens, who needs to be there at the shelter? You need to create a shelter-in-place plan, possibly. So that way, if you may not be able to evacuate, or maybe this is a disaster where it doesn't need to evacuate. And then you might need to create that evacuation plan. Do you have enough transportation vehicles and people that can drive and that sort of thing? A communications plan, and I'm going to go into these a little bit more in just a moment, but a communication plan is going to be really important. And when I talk communication plan, I'm actually talking internal communication and external communication with that. And then produce a public education campaign. Does anybody here have a public education campaign for their shelter now? Good. It's something to really look at and really, in my opinion, to really focus on because the more your public is prepared, in theory, the less they'll be bringing their animals to you. So, so looking at a public education campaign really can help your shelter if you have a pretty robust public education campaign and people are actually participating in that campaign. And then developing a training program, supporting an emergency animal shelter. So when I'm talking shelter today, I'm talking about your shelter now. But there's also an emergency animal shelter because you're already at capacity, right? So what you might end up doing, or what somebody might end up doing, is opening up a temporary emergency shelter somewhere so that way all the animals can go there. You can focus on your animals and they can focus on the other animals. But you might need to support that. Or if you are if your agency having jurisdiction, so your county or city agency, you may actually have to run that shelter also. So that's something else to try to create a plan for. So you also, when you're creating these plans, these goals, you need to look at what might not be a priority for your shelter before, during, and after this disaster. It may not be a priority to do adoptions, for example. If you're doing adoptions, then you might not be able to have the bandwidth to take care of all the animals too. So you need to figure out what those things that you shouldn't be doing, pet licensing, your normal social media posts, and the other big one is if you're going to be open or closed to the public. So maybe your shelter does a lot of spay-neuter. Are you able to do spay-neuter during this event? And so that might be something that you need to look at. And when you do, then you need to rope in communications along with that so that people know that you're not open at all or you're not open for certain things. So when you're doing this, it's going to be important to share these responsibilities. So you're going to manage the capabilities of what you're able to do in the disaster with the shared responsibilities. You need to include the best people for the job. Now, when people are doing your essential personnel that are working in a disaster, they may have a completely different role during a disaster than they would during day-to-day operations. So keep that in mind also. And the other thing is this, having this together may actually help create a stronger team for you. This is a lot of stuff going on. So if you look at this pie, it's a scary pie, right? But if you take it and you try to break it apart, it'll make it a lot easier. So when I was talking about different people that might be essential personnel or different assignments, one of them might be essential personnel. You might want to have somebody looking at potential hazards or reviewing current plans, finances, and that sort of thing. I'll be going over these. So again, going back to that scary pie, if you take this and you take a slice at a time, it's going to make this a lot easier. So a lot of people get overwhelmed by looking at the bigger picture rather than taking it one bite at a time. So essential personnel. When we talk about essential personnel, we need to figure out who might need to be there for the disaster, before, during, and after. Who needs to be there? Is this leadership? I hope so. I hope there's some leadership that's there. Leadership is going to be really important. Is there some veterinary care, via veterinarian, vet techs? Is there somebody that's going to be there that can take care of animals, or do you have access to that type of person during this disaster? Of course, if you have animals on site, you're going to have people taking care of those animals. So some of those might be essential personnel. If you're going to be continuing intake of animals because you have space in your shelter, then you need to make sure you have people that can do that. An important one that I think a lot of people don't think about is finance. When I was with the fire department, one of the things that I had, and I'll be talking about this in a minute, but one of the issues that I had is we would have a disaster. I would go out on disasters all the time, and my credit card wouldn't work. And it would be a weekend, and I couldn't get a hold of anybody at the office. So I'm calling my fire chief on his cell phone at 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to get my credit card to work so I could fuel up whatever rig I was on. So finance might be a really important one to have. IT if you're going to be doing anything with computers, they're my heroes. they're the ones that keep everything going. So they might be essential personnel. Volunteer management, so if you're going to have volunteers coming in, and then again going back to that communications, who might be somebody that can handle the communications. So when you're doing this, it's important to make sure that you have backups. And so if you're saying that Tim Perciful is going to be in this role, well, what if Tim Perciful's on vacation? So you need to make sure that it's really for the position, and then you have those people have a backup or two for each of those positions for essential personnel. Each role should have a job description. So when you're trying to figure out what each person is going to be doing or each role is going to be doing, if they don't have a job description, you're giving them free range to do whatever. And you probably have them as essential personnel because you need certain things done. So it's important whenever you're figuring out these essential personnel, it's also important to make sure that they know what they should be doing. Because remember, they might be doing communications during a disaster, but their normal job might be working the front desk at your shelter or something like that. And the roles may vary day to day, so you might have may vary from their daily operations, which we've already talked about. And then the important one that I think a lot of people don't think about when it comes to essential personnel is, can any of them work remotely? So can your communications people, can they be at home? Or your IT person, can they work remotely? So that way they don't have to come in. And so, or let's say that they live, they have an hour commute every day. And so if they have an hour commute, are they actually able to come in physically? And if not, are they able to do it remotely? So the point of this, and what this picture is about, is you're trying not to juggle all these things all at once. So trying to break it up to where multiple people are doing different things. So we've already talked about identifying potential hazards and concerns, but it's important to have somebody to look at that. So you can look around and kind of figure out, okay, yeah, this area floods on a regular basis, or here's the weather that comes in, it gets really hot or whatever, and we don't have air conditioning. But have somebody that's actually, that's their role during this planning process, is to look at what might be coming in. And they might be working with emergency management, they might be working with other groups to see what might be happening. They might have a certain, in their job description, they might have to report on what's coming in. So this is an important one, to make sure you have somebody that's watching that. With the ASPCA, we have that Dick Green back there is always looking at what's going on in the weather and trying to warn people what's happening. There we go. So then it's also important to identify hazards within your shelter. So if your fire code's not up to date, or you're in a flood zone, if you're in wildfire country and you haven't done anything around your shelter and there's a chance that something might burn, those sort of things. A good person for this, in my personal opinion, is somebody that does maintenance around your shelter. They know all those things inside and out. So that might be a really good person to look at what are some of these potential hazards that we have that might impact the shelter itself. So that might be something that you look at for your plan. So then you want to review your plans. So are they up to date? So this is something you can look at, see it, work with your fire department. Are the codes up to, are you up to code? Have you been doing your fire drills? Do you have a communications plan already? So if you already have a plan, then go back to that plan and really look at it. See what you might already have. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Now, I say that, but it's really easy for somebody new coming in and not know that there's a plan. So it's a good idea to really ask around and see if there's been a plan for whatever part of the shelter. And it might be for transport. There might be a plan for transporting, and you just don't know it because you're working in a different area. So ask around and see who might already have this, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But you might also need to update it, because there might be sometimes where, okay, well, this plan was done 10 or 15 years ago, and now they put in this major highway, or now this warehouse is right next to us. So it's important to continually update those plans. So I don't know how many of you know Wile E. Coyote, but Wile E. Coyote was notorious for creating these extravagant plans. So here's a plan, a blueprint of what Wile E. Coyote was doing to capture the roadrunner. So it's important to make sure you have these plans. So I already mentioned this, but it's important to make sure that you review codes. And when you're creating these plans, reviewing these plans, it might be good to work with emergency management also, because there might be something that's happening, maybe, like I said, the road or something. There might be evacuation routes that they've changed where you're not aware of it. So there's a lot of reasons to coordinate with other organizations. So capacity. This is a huge one. Capacity. So if you're going to be shelter in place, what's the number of animals you can shelter in place? For how long? Do you have enough food, water? Is somebody going to come pick up your waste? And then for each species. So if you have, a warehouse full of cat food, but a car full of dog food, then your capacity for cats is probably going to be a lot more than dogs. If you're going to say that, yeah, we can bring in horses, but you don't have any supplies for horses, then that would be another thing to really look at for capacity if you're going to be sheltering in place, not moving. And it's pretty much the same thing if you're going to be evacuating. So if you're going to be transporting animals, how far can you take them? Can you transport them in hot weather or cold weather? That's an important one, because a lot of transport vehicles might be somebody's van and there's no air conditioning back there, or no heat during the cold weather, and they might have to go 2 or 3 hours. So that's something to really look at. And then can you ride share with other shelters? So if multiple shelters are going to be evacuating, could you share some of that capabilities with other groups to try to evacuate your animals? And of course, we already talked about animals that come into your shelter, and how many can you bring in, and what species can you bring in. And that's going to be a really important one. I know I've talked about that a few times, but it's really important for you to identify what animals you're going to bring in. If you're going to say, yeah, we can handle reptiles, then you need to make sure that you're able to have electricity to keep them warm during the winter months. Or if you're going to bring in, seems like we've had more fish on recent disasters, so are you able to keep their pumps going to keep them comfortable and alive, actually? But then we also look at capacity of deceased animals, which no one really wants to think about, but how many deceased animals can you handle? Do you have a freezer and that's it? Do you have a freezer and no generator? So how many, and again, what species, how big or whatever can you handle? And so that's something else to really look at and try to think ahead of time of what you might be able to keep with the shelter. I hope that most shelters have generators as a backup, but some parts of the country may not need it as much as others. Where I live, we have windstorms all the time, and you pretty much have to have a generator. And I live in earthquake country, so you have to have a generator. But when you're looking at generators, what will that power? So if you go out and buy a generator that's this big, that's not going to power your entire shelter. So it's important to really pay attention to what that generator can power. And then some places, when they have a generator that powers their shelter, they might even color code the outlets, because it might be this outlet in this room, that outlet in this room works and no other one does. It might be certain rooms have them. So it's important to identify which outlets work. And then if you do have a generator, how much fuel do you have? Or how much fuel can you have? Because that's how the generators keep going. And if you can't get fuel, then your generator is not going to last for a long time. Then on top of that is, if you're trying to get fuel and the gas station doesn't have a generator, then they can't pump it. So I was on a wildfire a few years ago where we had about an hour and a half driving distance where there was one gas station, and there was a line for about 3 or 4 blocks to get fuel. So that's something to really think about as your fuel. And then if you're going to have a generator, if it's one built into the shelter, that's great. But if it's a portable one, you have carbon monoxide detectors. You have a way to keep it safe and that sort of thing. And do you have a plan to test that generator monthly to make sure it's going to work when you need it and let it run? Capacity for staff and volunteers. If they're going to be working and there's a disaster, there may not be restaurants open. It might be they may have to drive an hour and a half around a way, which usually takes them 15 minutes because the road's closed. So do you have food? Do you have water, whatever for them to drink? If they live a long ways away, are you going to house them? And if so, do you have a sleeping area for them, cots or whatever? So those are some things to think about. And that might change depending on what your personnel are throughout the years. Finances. This is one of that's not exciting, but it's crucial. So one of the things to think about with financing is donations. So most shelters are, they receive donations all the time. So that should be pretty simple, but if not, you need to figure out a way for people to donate money. It might be to a certain fund or a certain bank account or whatever, but really look at that for a disaster. It's also going to be really good for your external communications later on. If you already have that set up, they can create all the material ahead of time, so that way when the disaster happens, they can just push a button and send, and that information can get sent everywhere. Along with that is, you need to have a plan. I don't really have it in this section, but you need to have a plan for donations, physical donations, because I'll tell you, I've been on so many disasters, and the biggest issue that we have is people bringing in their donations, and they mean well, and some of them are great, but can you handle a ton of crates and old blankets? We had a wedding dress that came in for a shelter. What are we going to do with the wedding dress? So then you have to think about what you're going to do with these things. So that's another thing to think about, is what you're going to do with these donations. And then I already mentioned, will people be able to make purchases? So your essential personnel, if there's no electricity and all they have is a credit card, can they go down and get gas? Or if there's no self-service, can they do anything with their credit card? They can't call anybody or whatever. So are they able to make those purchases? And then do they have authority? So if there's a credit card, let's say you have a credit card that's for the shelter and anybody can grab it. Well, with that, you might need to have some important information like the PIN number, the zip code, so that way whenever this person goes and tries to make a purchase with the credit card and they're asking, well, what's your zip code? They know what the zip code is, or the PIN number. So finances are important when it comes to this. And then I already mentioned, should a finance person be part of essential staff? So that's an important thing to look at. And I'm not saying that they do, it's just something to think about. And will you be able to pay the bills? So let's say this disaster is going on for a month, 2 months, whatever. Are you going to be able to pay those bills? And so it's important to start looking at this ahead of time. How far out can you go? Or are you going to have a lot more expenses during the disaster to where you're not able to get the normal bill paying going on? And then grants. Again, most animal shelters work with grants all the time, but are there any grants available before, during, or even after during the recovery phase for the shelter? And then when you're doing this, it's important to keep track of your finances. So keeping track of your finances is going to help you later on, but it might also be really important to be reimbursed if this becomes declared as a national disaster or even a statewide disaster. If there's a reimbursement possibilities, it's going to be important that you keep track of everything that you spend. So every receipt, just everything. So that's a really important part. Partnerships. I've talked about this a little bit, but it's important to create partnerships and they're going to be able to help you during this disaster plan. Now, when you're creating partnerships, a partnership is not just what you can get from somebody else, but what you can also provide to them. And trust me, you can provide a lot to them. If you're working with emergency management, you are the experts around, you're the experts around there with the animal issues, so you might really be able to help them with the city plan, county plan, or whatever emergency management you're working with. So just remember that you are important to them too, so reach out to them and see how they can help you and how you can help them. One of the ones that's really difficult is working with other shelters, because you're almost competitors, if you will. So during disaster, it's important to really get together and start working together, so that way you can share those resources. Why duplicate efforts? You might be able to, if a veterinarian, for example, if you have a shelter on the other side of town, you might be able to share a veterinarian to go back and forth, or general care, or whatever that is. So then you also have state animal response teams or county animal response teams, CARTs and SARTs. They may be able to help. I thought I saw somebody, maybe they left, wearing a CERT shirt before in here. But CERT, Community Emergency Response Teams, might be another organization to really partner with. They might be able to help you with general care or traffic or whatever. There's a lot of things that CERT teams can do, and a lot of cities and communities, I should say, have those. Volunteer organizations. There's a volunteer organization in my neck of the woods that feeds emergency personnel. So when I'm talking about food, that was part of our plan is, well, they can come in. Now it's important to look at and to ask them, who else are you going to be feeding, or who else are you working with something like that? Because one of the concerns is if they're supposed to be feeding 20 different places, do they have the capacity to add you to that? And so we, in Arkansas just recently, we were being fed by a group, and we just became too much. Our disaster response for the animals was too much for them. So they asked if they could stop feeding us, and we're like, that's no problem whatsoever. So that's something to really look at. Unfortunately, that happened at dinner time. There wasn't much planning, so it was like, hurry up and try to figure this out. Breed clubs. So I know shelters are mainly talking about rescue, but there's breed clubs out there that might be able to help, or certain specific clubs, animal-related clubs that might be able to help during a disaster. They might be able to help financially. They might be able to help bring stuff or transport or whatever. You know, dog show people. I mean, I don't know if even you've seen some of the things that people travel with dog shows. They're amazing. So you might have somebody locally that can help with that transport. Partnerships with law enforcement. Law enforcement's a big one. You know, one of the things that you can provide to law enforcement is some training to them, for their officers, for animal handling or something like that. So they may be able to help you with, you know, what needs to happen during the disaster, how evacuations take place, that sort of thing. But remember, during the off time, there's ways that you can help them too. I've mentioned fire departments several different times, but another one is professional organizations. Your veterinary medical association. Maybe it's where I live is Boeing and Microsoft, so maybe there's a union that might be able to help you out. That's a big one. A lot of those larger companies, for example, have groups that are there to help for certain things. So if you can create a group to help you with your animal shelter, that would be awesome. And like I said, the VMA, Veterinary Medical Association, or the Medical Reserve Corps, or something like that might be a really good one to have that comes in. And businesses. I already kind of talked about that with Boeing, but businesses might be able to come in and give you a grant, might be able to give you some people, that sort of thing. So that's a really good one to look at. And then, of course, the national organizations. And this could be organizations like the ASPCA or different animal groups, but it could also be, you know, some sort of, let's say you're in the newspaper industry, it could be some national organization with the newspapers that might be able to help you out. Universities. Universities are incredible. We've used universities, vet students to come look at animals, help us do nail trims, shave some of the animals where that may have been impacted, or even treat. So universities can be a really good one. A lot of them, if you work with them ahead of time, they may have a curriculum for that. So this could be part of what those students are required to do. And then organizations like the Cattlemen's Association, there's different horse organizations, that sort of thing. So a lot of people don't think about the agriculture side of it, but there's a lot of agriculture that may actually really be beneficial for you and really be able to help you during these disasters. I don't know how the heck that cat just sits there like that. He's trying to help by keeping the dog's head warm, I guess. All right, so now we get to the communications part. So communications. Internal communications. So one of the big ones is who's going to notify those essential personnel. And one of the ways that some places do it, and it's a really simple way, it's not 100% accurate or the best, but it's a really good one, is when the schools close for a snowstorm or whatever, then that's when the essential personnel come in. Now, it doesn't work for everything because schools are closed during the summer and there might be a flood or something, but that might be a really easy one. All right, if the schools are closed, we're going to either be closed, or if they're on a 2-hour delay, then we're going to be on a 2-hour delay. So that way people are already paying attention to that because of their kids, and it's all over the news. So that might be one way. Or you might have a phone tree, you might have an email, a text chain, whatever it is. Just some way to having somebody look in how you're going to notify essential personnel. And then is this going to be one person that's going to decide this, or are you going to have a committee of people that's going to decide when essential personnel are in place? And remember, if it's one person, you need to have a backup, because if that person's unavailable, then you need to make sure you have somebody else, a succession of who to contact. If it's a committee, it's also going to be important to make sure you give them a timeline. When this goes out, we need a vote by, within an hour or whatever it is. So that way they don't wait all day when you have people trying to figure out if they need to come into work. So how are you going to do that? And we've already mentioned this a little bit, but how are you going to contact people? Are you going to be, do people have a radio? Are they going to be using email? Are you going to have signage? So are you just going to put a sign out in front saying, yeah, we're closed, and that's how the people that are coming in for daily care? What are you going to do when it comes to that internal communications? Also, briefings. So if you're going to be doing a disaster, you're going to possibly have a briefing. That's going to be really important, because remember, you have people that might be doing a job today that's not part of their normal job. And I'll tell you, every day on a disaster can be different. So it's going to be important to have briefings. And generally, your morning briefing is going to be, here's what we need to do today. And then you have an evening briefing. And by the way, when it's the morning briefing, it's mainly me talking to you. The evening briefing, after you get done with work, you're talking to me. What went well, what needs to happen, and then I might be talking to you, yeah, we can't do anything about that because of this or that. But then your communication from that evening briefing is going to help me with that morning briefing tomorrow. So having a couple briefings a day could be a really good way to have that internal communication. If you're going to be relying on email, again, is IT part of your essential personnel? And then signage. Signage is really good, actually. I mentioned the signage out in the front, but it might be also that you put up signage saying, okay, this area right now is now isolation area. It's usually where our dogs is, but now it's isolation. So having those pre-made signs might be really good to have within your shelter, because people coming in and out and everything's a little bit different. So what's that internal communication going to look like? And then your external communications. Now, I'm biased on this because I was a public information officer, but it's important to make sure you have somebody that can relay messages. And it might be through social media, it might be through TV, radio, that sort of thing. But one of the really important ones is to have them liaison or coordinate with other communication processes. There's something called a joint information center or a joint information system. So that way, what that is that's public information officers with the city, county, state, whoever it be, that are releasing information out to everybody. I'll tell you that as a public information officer for fire service, I never once got anything from an animal shelter, but there were always animal needs that I needed. So if you're able to have a public information officer coordinate with those others, public information officers, your message might be able to reach a lot farther out there and reach multiple audiences. They might be able to hit multiple languages, all kinds of stuff. When you start going out with that, there's a lot of benefits to it. A liaison officer. Who's in here taking incident command classes? Any incident command classes? Good. So some of these terms are going to be fairly familiar. A liaison officer is important because they're the people that communicate with other organizations. That might be stakeholders. It might be other shelters. It might be, the big one is a Red Cross shelter. If you're having an emergency, temporary emergency animal shelter, then having a liaison officer that talks to the human Red Cross shelter is going to be really important and really beneficial for you and for them. And then having somebody at the Emergency Operations Center, if there is some sort of disaster, if they can go out there, they're going to be able to tell you about what you are able to do, what you are doing, what your needs are, and then they're going to be able to tell you, okay, yeah, tomorrow we're expecting it to flood in this area, and so you're going to have that much more information from the officials that are working there. So having a liaison officer, in my opinion, is one of the most important things and probably one of the most underutilized positions out there. I talked about public education campaigns. So if the more prepared, again, your community is, in theory, the less they'll be bringing animals to you during this disaster. So it's important to have a good public education campaign. And a lot of this stuff you can steal. This is, as you can see, from ready.gov. So this is from FEMA. But another thing that you can do is you can take your public education campaign and give that to the public information officer, and they can send it on. But having this done beforehand is really going to be a huge benefit. Then you need to look at your resources. When I talk about resources, I'm talking about stuff, I'm talking about people, I'm talking about just what's needed and what you have. The first thing that you need to do is you need to look at what you have. How many crates do you have? If you need to evacuate animals and you have 100 animals in your shelter, do you have 100 crates to evacuate them? Do you have 50 crates to where you have to make 2 trips? What do you have? If you're going to be driving, do you have people that can drive this big truck and trailer? So what are those resources that you have, and then that will help you determine what you'll need. So that's a really important one to look at. And there are organizations that can help you with those available resources. So maybe your local moving truck company, you have an agreement with them to where they can help you during disaster. So what's the cost? Maybe the local moving truck company will help you, but they'll just give you a discounted rate. So what's the cost of that? And then how long will they last? Because maybe you might be in a place where, okay, they're going to store all these goodies that you got, all these donations that you got, but how long are they going to store them? Are they going to have to open that warehouse up and you're going to have to get rid of those items quickly or something? And then how long are they needed? So if they say that, yeah, you know what, we can be here for a week, but you need them for 2 weeks, then you're going to have multiple resources to cover that time. You don't want to kill your people helping you out. Training. There's the surveys that are going around. There's one from a couple national surveys, and then we're looking at doing state surveys also. And one of the things that we're hearing a lot is people want training. And training either helps you get a new skill or helps you become more proficient at a skill. And that can be all kinds of things. It can be leadership training, it can be technical rescue, it can be sheltering, whatever it is. So it's important to look at training on training your people for disaster. So this might be part of your disaster preparedness plan, is to have someone that's really in charge of training. And there's all kinds of training. There's training that you can do online. Of course, ASPCA Pro has a lot of training, webinars, etc. Justice Clearinghouse has some webinars that you can do. And then, let's see if I can do this right. Is that doing it? There we go. So these FEMA classes, if I asked earlier who's taken FEMA classes, these are the basic FEMA classes. So if you're going to be doing stuff out in the field with any organization, really, these are going to be really important. ICS 100, 200 are probably the most common, but then 700 and 800. And then there's also some animal-related ones. So there's stuff that you can do online that's pretty easy. So it might be that somebody just shows you a certificate. Yeah, I did this training. And so you don't even have to have a group of people. They can do it when they have a time. But then you can also do the practical training. And this might be with animal response teams. Maybe it's a sheltering operation. Maybe it's technical skills. This is some technical large animal rescue training that was in Louisiana earlier this year. And that sort of thing. The other part with this training is it's going to really help with some networking, and I hope that you guys are networking here during this conference, because that networking is going to be really important during a disaster. And then you have all kinds of other training. Emergency management is just another one. So if you're going to have a liaison officer, having them going in and doing some training with the Emergency Operations Center, taking some advanced incident command classes might be really beneficial. Or it might be training on leadership, or it might be training on sheltering, whatever the organization. But more classroom and practical training might be a really good thing to look at too. And it might be a good way to do that is to see about holding that regionally, so that way you can get a lot of different organizations in there to help split the costs on some of the training that you might want to have come in. Training can also include like fire drills, having communication. These are exercises, sorry. Exercises and drills, fire drills, communication drills. Communication drills is a really important one. Yeah, you can have a whole bank of radios, but if you've never tried them, then it's going to be pointless, because people aren't going to know what to do with them, how to use them. So it's going to be important. Having tabletop exercises, that sort of thing. So training and exercises and drills are really important. You can have all the expertise in the world, but if you never do it, it's not going to work. So when you look at the Beatles, or your favorite band, or your favorite sports team, look at how much they practiced before they had their first gig, or before they played their first game. So it's important to look at something like that, because when the disaster hits, you want to be as prepared as possible. So if you have practiced and your drills, then when the real one happens, you're going to be that much better at it. And even though you have your best made plans, I showed you this picture earlier, and if anybody knows Wile E. Coyote, he knows that, yeah, they need to be practiced, because there's always something that can happen. So, anybody not familiar with Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner? Okay, thank you. All right, so relax. There's a lot out there, but if you just take it one bite at a time, establish your priorities, you'll get through it. And it might be that you have a fire drill this month and a tornado drill next month, or you create a shelter-in-place plan this year and an evacuation plan next year. Whatever it is, just take one bite at a time. And don't hesitate to beg, borrow, and steal. There's all kinds of plans and resources out there. So use whatever's available for you. And we have this animal emergency preparedness self-assessment checklist that will help you with some of these things. You can go on ASPCA Pro and type in disaster plan. There's all kinds of them. There's some of them for hurricane, telling you what you should be doing 3 days out, 2 days out, and whatnot. So there's all kinds of stuff out there. Again, beg, borrow, and steal. Don't try to create this from scratch. Do whatever you can to use other people's knowledge and resources. And then I also want to point out that at the end of this year is the NESEP Summit. This is going to be a huge conference with national partners, with national groups, all kinds of people that are going to be here. It's in my neck of the woods in Seattle, actually in Bellevue. But this is going to be, if you're interested in any sort of disaster-related stuff, this is going to be the place to be later this year. And there's my contact information. Well, thank you so much. I'll be around a little bit today. I have to fly out this afternoon, so I won't be here for too long. But feel free to hit me up if you have any questions on a one-on-one case. Thank you.